All right, welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I am here with Mary Perry. Mary, you want to say a quick hello?
Hello. That was very quick.
Mary recently gave a talk on design patterns at PHP NYC and is shortly on October 30th. If you are in the Philadelphia area, you should come to PHP Philly and see the second iteration of this talk. But before then, I thought it would be fun for us just to get on the show and talk a little bit about design patterns. Would you like to do a little bit more of an intro, or you want to jump straight into the topic?
Let's jump straight in.
I think I am a self-taught programmer. I don't have a lot of formal training. And I think when we start to get into sort of formal terminology around engineering, I definitely notice my imposter syndrome kick in. And I thought that your talk in New York really was super helpful for me to start to like overlay the knowledge that I have with like these terms that are in the industry. And I'm curious, what was your main like interest, or what kind of led you to think like this is what I want to talk about, this is what I want to give a talk about?
I think I I have a bit of imposter syndrome too. I didn't finish my degree, and I think that I wanted to have taken more classes than I actually got to. So I thought that going through design patterns while getting deeper into Laravel internals and trying to read code at the same time would be an interesting way to do it. But the thing that really kicked it off was I was building I'm still building because I got very sidetracked and they're very understanding people. But I was building a jobs board for the local tech meetup that I have. And I promised them that I would use Socialite to use a Slack logon in.
Okay.
Um, so I was doing all the things of Laravel's so great, everything's out of the box, you don't have to worry about anything. It turns out that there's not a very obvious Socialite provider for Slack, but I had already really talked it up, so I had to figure it out somehow. And so I got into extending Socialite to make a Slack provider
Okay.
and got deeper and deeper into source diving with that and was noticing that it is a pretty solid example of an abstract factory pattern.
Okay.
Um, I'm not entirely sure like when that clicked for me, but I think that it was just generally trying to understand dependency injection and factory patterns at about the same time and then being like, "Oh, this is actually like a factory within a factory." And then I was also very curious about the service container and service providers because they're not the easiest concept to grasp for me.
Sure.
So then that started to get deeper and deeper into like what is the service container, and it just really spiraled from there. I ended up reading a lot of the design patterns book, a lot of source code, and I've written at least 2 talks. So,
At least. Well, I saw, I mean, Joe and I were joking that we saw like 6 talks in New York. It was so much information.
it was dense. It
It
was
was
dense.
dense, but it was great.
Thank you.
Do you think you can summarize the abstract factory pattern, or is that too much to ask on the spot?
Well, a factory pattern, a concrete factory pattern, is a pattern that's a creational pattern that creates variants of the similar product. And an abstract factory pattern is basically a factory pattern that creates factories.
I see. Okay.
So it's kind of interesting because the example in the design patterns book is, I think, a widget factory, and it was
So
difficult
helpful.
for, yeah, because widgets, right? Um, I don't even necessarily understand what a widget is, except that I think that it's some type of component.
Well, I think a widget is meant to be a thing that doesn't exist. It's purely for like example purpose.
Right. In economics, it definitely is. In this, I think it's somewhere between that and like modals. It's
Like a
very
thing. Yeah.
confusing. I don't,
Okay.
yeah. But like a factory that makes widgets sounds kind of like the setup to a joke to me as an economics major. But being able to see the pattern used in Socialite so closely to how the book actually presents it was very illuminating. It made everything seem a lot more useful to read and to dive deeper into.
Yeah, I mean that was definitely the biggest takeaway from me watching your talk was just like, I've looked at the Socialite source code, right? I've looked at the service container. I've looked at how Laravel instantiates, you know, uh, cache implementations or session implementations, stuff like that. And I broadly have a vague understanding of like the idea of a factory pattern, but to kind of see these more formal definitions of these patterns and like sort of the way they are structured when they're like being talked about as patterns, it, often in these like very abstract terms or very vague terms like widget, and then to actually like look at that in the context of a thing that I already understand, which is socialite or um, the way that the sessions are implemented. It just like made it click so much more. And so like in the case of socialite, so we've got providers, right? Different providers of authentication, like Facebook or in your case Slack, right? And those providers, are those providers then factories? They are responsible for instantiating like a socialite authenticated user object. Is
Yes,
that how that works? And
that's how
so
I understand
then
it.
each one of those uses a different mechanism to give you back a single, this is a representation of a social login, right?
Yes,
And so there's a second layer on top of that, which is how do we get the thing that does that? And that's what makes it an abstract factory. Is there's the system that has to instantiate the Slack provider or the Facebook provider or the Twitter provider. Okay. Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, that's not that hard to understand. But if you said to me abstract factory pattern, I just kind of look at you like, okay, maybe I'll get it in context.
it's an interesting terminology. And then the difference between the actual family of products, it refers to it as a family of products, is usually just like an OAuth token for a given provider.
hmm.
So that's like the
Okay.
main difference.
Right. Right. Yeah. Sure. I think another big thing that came out of your talk and like and just like the conversations that I had afterwards came down to that this idea that the patterns themselves or like the the specific way one goes about implementing one of these patterns or like the sort of the formality around them is less important than the fact that we have names for these things that let us sort of communicate to each other a more complex idea. Because like that makes so much sense. It's like once I like internalize what an abstract factory is, it's a lot easier to say like, oh, using an abstract factory here makes a lot of sense instead of saying like, oh, we should do the thing, like the thing that they do in Socialite where there's like a thing that creates a thing and then that thing creates another thing. It's just I think that in a lot of ways it feels like design patterns can be weaponized against people who if someone doesn't feel like a developer is doing something the right way, they'll reference design patterns as sort of like, well, this is what this is what you're supposed to do. and I think that that can give them a bad name. And I think in particular in the Laravel community, that has been the case. But it feels like that gets around what the real value is, which is just a common language to talk about complex ideas. Does that feel true to you?
That's definitely my opinion. I know that not everybody has the same opinion about it as me. And maybe part of it is that I'm a little bit that I experience imposter syndrome and I feel a little bit on the outside looking in. Naming things is famously difficult. And I think that a lot of times that I've seen more canonical implementations of design patterns, I've thought this is not how I would write something. And when I see code working in like a Laravel application or kind of deviations in Laravel source code, I think that it still solves problems in a really wonderful way, which is, I think, the other core of design patterns, or the argument that the design patterns make is that like these are ways that have worked to solve a problem. And so we should reuse them as opposed to, kind of winging it and seeing what happens. But design patterns is pretty specific to Java and it's pretty specific to an era of Java code. And it's great that the Gang of Four has all these works. Like Clean Code is another interesting one that I think has great things to say about naming things. And refactoring has a lot to say about naming things, but a lot of times in a real world application, you have to wing it a bit to get it to work. I was just reading a book today, actually. I forget the name of it. I think it was Architecture of Complex Applications with Examples in Laravel Code.
Okay.
And one of the earlier chapters starts off with software development is a trade off between what works in the short term versus what works in the long term. And I think having names for how closely we're going to solve a problem can also help make those trade offs. Does that make
That's
sense?
interesting. Yeah. No, I love that. That's such a good it's a good way to describe it. And yeah, I get what you're saying. Like, I mean, it's kind of the same argument as like RESTful architecture or just conventions in general. It's like there are a million different ways to approach something, and like maybe sometimes one way is has advantages over the other way, and like you can take lessons that other people have learned and sort of not have to learn them yourself by just like following the convention. Other times conventions are just useful because they're conventions. It's just like if everyone is talking about it and thinking about it the same way, it just makes it easier to understand. And so I can see making that argument for, yeah, there's a million different ways to like implement like the creation of classes, like of instances of classes. Um, but if you stick to a few of these like well established patterns, depending on your use case and your like, requirements, you've put yourself in a position to just have an easier time discussing the code and having new developers understand the code, and like you just don't have to make up new language around that stuff. So even if it isn't like I can see the argument for like some of this comes from hard learned lessons, and I can also see the argument for just like it doesn't even matter if it came from hard won lessons. It's like if you uh if you use a common language, it's just easier to communicate, right?
And if you have a set of options to use to solve a problem that more two or more people in a conversation already understand what the big idea behind the term is, I think it makes for more interesting conversations. I think that there's a certain amount of understanding that happens in the Laravel community that at first to me was very intimidating, just knowing what a package does. And I think the
Okay.
same way that I've been intimidated by design patterns, when somebody says, oh, you could just use whatever example of a package, like, I don't know, Nova. If I don't know what it is off the top of my head, then it can feel like I'm missing out at the beginning of a conversation
Mm,
that the other
interesting.
participants in the conversation already have like the vocabulary for. But the more that I learned about first and third party packages in Laravel and the way that Laravel works, the more I feel like I have like this cool language that I can talk about complicated ideas and the examples and variants that I've seen of those with other developers very quickly. So I think that there's things that people who know design patterns would benefit from learning about in the Laravel community because most of the packages solve a problem that you're going to run into on a website. Like they're chosen because they're useful and because they solve things. And a lot of things that Laravel developers might want to know about design patterns to have similar conversations. But I don't think that it has to be like canonical. And I don't like the idea of, you know, using them to show that you know more about a particular idea than other developers. I think that if two people are on the same page, they're great, and if they're not, then it probably doesn't matter too much.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting analogy. I can totally see how that would be the case because the sort of Laravel community has embraced um I don't know, just not just embraced, but there's just such an abundance of really high quality packages for Laravel that like understanding what that what the space of possibility there is, and knowing like, okay, if I'm doing this, like there's these three packages that I should be thinking about. Like it is like a similar form of knowledge to have to hold on to. It's interesting. I was just recording with Joe. Actually, he's doing a this side projects podcast, and one of the points that came up in that conversation that I hadn't exactly like, it feels true to me, but I hadn't exactly put into words, was just this like kind of realization that so much of programming experience just comes down to having seen things before, having solved similar problems before, and being able to like apply that knowledge to the new problem, right? Like I have dealt with, I've dealt with social login before, right? So I know that I want to reach for social A, and I know that if there isn't a provider for the third party, that like I kind of already know generally how I would go about implementing that, just because like it's something that I've seen before. And it strikes me that in a lot of ways, one of the values of these design patterns and like having names for these things is almost like that is very useful as an individual, but it ends there. It's like you need something else to kind of like have a shared to have a shared experience of that, right? Because you and I might have both seen like an abstract factory implementation in Socialite and have a pretty solid understanding of like how that works. But if we don't have the language to talk about that, it's kind of like our knowledge is useless. Uh-oh, it looks like maybe we're having an issue. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Can you hear
I
me?
I can. Oh, yeah, I just lost you for a second there. Did you? Okay. Let's
Okay.
keep on going. I got a little alert pop up saying that your connection might be uh gone, but I see you there, so we're good.
Yeah, I heard wind outside, and that's what it takes around here. Just like a
Uh-oh.
little bit of wind.
Does that make sense, what I was saying? Like that you know, if we don't have a way to talk about this like knowledge that each of us has, then the fact that both of us have the knowledge is less useful to us.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, I have a book on OAuth too, without any kind of wrapper or any particular usage for it. I also have a book on, uh, oh man, basically API patterns in PHP specifically
Okay.
and Guzzle, and then comparing that to Saloon. I'm bringing that into the conversation. And I think that there are
Love
a lot
Saloon.
of times in when I was first learning Laravel and I didn't know about Saloon, I was gifted with a copy of Ash Allen's API book through Laravel's, which is really fantastic. That's how I found out about that. But before that, I was trying to do things that are wrapped around Guzzle pretty clumsily. I um, and I've definitely written things in Python around OAuth too that were just broken for weeks. Rissa Jackson, in her talk about junior developers, said, there's nothing worse than being stuck and alone. And I've spent like a
Mm,
lot of time on both of those topics being totally stuck and feeling super alone
yeah.
about it. And even if I was successful in doing something for a side project or a project at work that I'm not working with somebody else on, and I get it to work, it feels like less of a victory than even like chiming in on Twitter to somebody else's success and being able to talk about how cool their success is. But something that I really enjoy personally being able to talk about is breaking things because I feel like when I break things in a lot of different ways, it shows me how the thing works and it gives me more of a sense of why other people's solutions are useful or why there are a limited subset of like correct ways of going about something.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's interesting.
And those are great conversations to have too. I think I've broken like SQL Alchemy and PsychoPG2 with Python in all the ways that I can think of off the top of my head to break something. So if I found additional ones, I'm going to be happy about it, but that makes me feel like more confident about my ability to talk about it and more confident about my ability to use it even though I don't have that much outside validation for how proficient I am with Python. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think I mean, I definitely find that like someone can tell me, tell me the answer. uh but it's not nearly as satisfying to me as if I find the answer myself, and I think you're right that like I think part of that comes from like understanding how things can break, helps you avoid breaking things in the future, right? Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Is there is there a particular design pattern that you like, that you just particularly love or just like jumps out at you as just like an elegant solution to a problem or just like an interesting an interesting approach to something?
There's a lot that I like. That's kind of a hard thing to think about. I do really love the builder pattern, but I also like queries and databases in general. And I think the best canonical example of a builder pattern in Laravel, which I did not put in my talk because it's very straightforward, and I was doing this whole thing with middleware and the request cycle, which I'm going to have to go back and maybe look at again, is the Eloquent Query Builder, which again is named very clearly. The examples that I usually see for the builder pattern online is like making a hamburger, which I don't really understand why that's the common example because it's not the one in the and you don't use code to make hamburgers. I don't mean like a hamburger menu. I mean like an actual hamburger, like add lettuce
Yeah,
as an
yeah.
example
I mean,
function.
I get how it could be used as an example, right? You've got a thing that can be put together in a bunch of different ways. It, I get it on the surface, it makes sense, but yeah, it does seem like a sort of a silly thing to use.
Yeah, but I don't know. I really like the idea of having a chronological order of steps that you go through with variances in the steps. I tend to think of object-oriented programming as like recipes. Like when you cook
Hmm.
something, you have the ingredients that you're going to cook with, you have the tools that you need to cook the ingredients with, or you're missing some and you have to improvise. And then once you have those as a basis, you need to perform actions which you may or may not be competent in performing. And I think a lot of that, I think about that when I think about where I want a route to go or how I want to modify data. And the builder pattern kind of maps to that very directly. I think that's why I find it so appealing. You also need that for spells, and programming is basically modern wizardry. So it's
I love that. I, I love that you picked the builder pattern because I think that was the one. I don't know that I necessarily had the name for it at the time, but I feel like that was the one time that like a design pattern, like a concept that was like, oh, I'm applying a specific pattern to like solve this problem, like really jumped out at me. Was I'm trying to think of where we were using it. I don't know that it really matters, but just there's a point in our code base where there was just really complex, very conditional, like varied logic. A good example that I can think of, I don't know if this is the code where I had the particular aha moment, but an example that I can think of is in our billing code. We deal with both Stripe authorized.net and also paper invoices and free credits and e-checks and physical checks and all sorts of stuff. And we also do monthly and yearly billing. We do invoice billing. We do just our billing scenario just is uh, a nightmare. and but we have some unified models that we use internally to represent, billing charge or a refund or a subscription or whatever you have. And I know that you know a good example of where we're using a builder pattern is in building up a subscription, right? Under adding, applying the correct payment processor, setting a subscription to monthly or yearly. We have both like individual implementations inside of these builders, and then independent builders that like are responsible for a subset of that work. And it really is a way to take this incredibly complicated system and at least make each part something that you can reason about, and like and make it easier to reason about how all the different parts interact with each other. And so I don't know. I don't all of that is to say I feel like if you asked me the same question, I think I would say the same thing, that is my favorite design pattern. It's certainly the one that like kind of just I don't know, it felt like it clicked in a special way for me as like, oh, this is when you have a certain level of variability and complexity. This is just like such a nice way to approach that problem.
I think that it's also interesting to something that I spend a lot of my real estate and my brain thinking about when I'm not actually working and I'm just like, walking down the street or whatever, is the different ways that you can address conditional changes in code and like the different ways that that direction can go, like if statements versus nested if statements versus switches versus like a pipe. And I think that it's a really interesting thing to have in common with someone or to have a different opinion on when you're having a conversation about like how do you think the most elegant way to address those changes are, like how do you conceptualize it. So I think that's very cool. I'm not sure if statements or switch statements are the anti-pattern, but I know some people think they're an anti-pattern and other people think that they're not, and it's just I guess I would have to know a lot of more about performance to know what the right way is, but to me a builder pattern is a easier thing to read than other ways of doing it.
Yeah, I mean for sure. And like the places where like using an if versus using like a more complicated structure that abstracts the logic away a little bit. Like the times when that performance difference really matters are so few and far between. Like there are cases where it does come up. And I think that there are times, I think particularly a little bit of I don't know if it's a pet peeve, but like a little thing that I find myself doing in the Laravel world in particular is, we love our collections. We're obsessed with collections. We use collections everywhere. And I love collections. Boy, do I love collections. I use them all over the place too. I'm not saying that collections aren't great, because they certainly are. But boy, also there's sometimes that just like a for loop is so much better. And it's not even for performance reasons. It's just like for code readability, for just like the straightforwardness of the code. You're not like importing a bunch of variables into context using the use statements. Like it just already is in context. Like there are a lot of times when just doing a good old plain old for loop is just the way to go. And in the same way, I think there are plenty of times that just a simple if statement, a couple if statements, maybe a match statement can be a great solution to a problem. Like sometimes you don't have to overthink it, but there's definitely a time when that becomes not true. Right? There's a time when the code, you just look at it and you just know this is not the right solution anymore. I need something that maybe isn't going to be, maybe it's going to be 14 microseconds less performant or whatever, but like I I am going to be able to reason about it, and that ends up being so much more important, right?
And that's so analogous to the iterator pattern too, because its collections are an amazing example of iterators. And I think that the benefit of having an iterator with all those functions built into it, like the Laravel collections have so many built-in functions that you just don't have to worry about,
Yeah.
is when you're trying to look at a group of data, which makes a lot of sense that it's like generally used with a a bunch of eloquent data taken straight from a database, where you're going to have to look at it in different ways and you want different methods of being able to interact with it versus like, am I looping through this once and I only have to do it once? Then you probably don't need to overthink like what type of iteration you're doing.
Hmm. So iterator is a, I think of iterator as just like a concept. I wouldn't have necessarily classified that as a design pattern, but that falls in the under the umbrella of design patterns.
Yes. And when I read the definition of the iterator and started to understand more of what is actually going on in a list, because I just thought of it as like get the next thing in the list, which it I guess it essentially is, but it has more to do with a cursor and setting like the head of a cursor and then returning a reference to that. It took me like 2 or 3 days to wrap my head around it fully of going back, taking breaks, going back and like looking at it again. And then once it finally clicked, I was like, oh, why didn't you just tell me that from the beginning? It was really weird.
Hmm.
But I always thought that iterators were just lists. But I also didn't really understand until I read the iterator design pattern what a cursor actually is in relation to database retrieval or like in relation to the index of a database. And I think that that fully clicked when I read it too, but I don't know how useful any of that necessarily is. I think it was just like a fun aha moment mostly. I'm not doing like capitalized real programming that I need to have that kind of performance really on anything. So,
Well, I don't know. So what is a cursor? I mean I have a functional understanding of a cursor, but I don't think I deeply understand the concept.
well, I really hope that this is right because I am self taught. So take it out with a grain of salt. But the iterator pattern is also known as the cursor pattern. And a cursor is a reference to an ID, basically. So
Okay.
in other languages that I've worked with, the IDs or the indexes on a list aren't necessarily as explicit. Like there's something that I've been taught to think about. kind of in the back burner, but you don't need to think about them. Just the fact that PHP in lists has the index that you can reference is very different to me. And so the idea is when you go through a group of items, some kind of like collection of items. I'm trying not to use collection because it means a different thing, but I
It's
mean like
fine.
the broader, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, in the abstract sense of a collection.
yeah. It's there's so many words that are just like the same word but have a completely different meaning in a different
Yes.
context. It's a
Yes.
lot. But when you go through a collection, you return basically a reference to an index as a means of referencing the list,
Okay.
like keeping a cursor in a group of elements that you've sorry, not elements, records that you retrieved from a database as an ID and traversing like that group of returns via the ID. And this is difficult for me to put into words because I think of it way more visually. But if you've ever gone into like see, I'm not even thinking of the right words now. But you know those websites that you can put in a SQL query and it tells you what happened behind the scenes to get that query?
Yeah, like the, planning. Yeah,
Yes.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The
It's
query
right there.
planner and yeah.
Yeah. It's the technical term is gonna come to me, like, an hour after we finish talking, I bet. But it's kind of like when you look at a bunch of those, it starts to make a little bit more sense, and it kinda comes together. I had to draw
Okay.
out a flow chart, like, my own flow chart of an iterator
Oh,
with a
that's
cursor in
interesting.
mind, so I can think of it in terms of that, but I'm still not at the point of mastery that I could just be like, "Oh, this is exactly what a cursor is." Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah, yeah. And
I'm getting
I think,
there.
as you talk about it, I can see, like, an iterator is really it is a pattern in that it's like it's a shared way to iterate over anything, right? Like we've defined like a way of iterating across all sorts of types of data using like a shared pattern. So that in that like when I think about it that way, I can see how of course it is a design pattern. It's just I think it's something that you see and deal with in PHP so much that I just think of it as like more like a language construct almost than a like a m- more abstract thing, but it doesn't mean that it isn't both. It's interesting.
Yeah. And then the idea of being able to define different ways to iterate is also part of the pattern. There's something that I do in Python a lot. There's like these dunder methods that you can put on the class, and one of them is like two underscores iter, two underscores again. And
Okay.
I find myself using a lot, like taking all of the attributes that I've put on a class and adding them all to an iterator function, or like selectively only using the ones that I'll have on a particular view as an iterator of that class or like some inherited version of the class. And
Okay.
then eventually I always get to the point where I'm like, I'm just writing my own DTO or like I'm rewriting an ORM to like make things easier for me. But it happens a lot and it works. So I
Uh-huh.
don't know if that counts as a pattern, but it's just like repetitive things that make CSVs easier, I guess. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, I say this all the time. I feel like so much of programming is just yeah, looping over data to export it or import it or process it or like so much of what we do at InternetGi at least is just like, all right, let's write another command that grabs 100,000 rows and does something with them, like one thing that I thought was I don't know, just really tickled me in your talk was the fact that the facade pattern does not describe facades in Laravel. Can you
Yeah, it's
say
like a
more about
small
that?
subset. One of well, I take a couple steps back. I got kind of nerd sniped into Laravel. I say that a lot. And I did a lot of Googling before I started using Laravel and saw a lot of those discussions on the internet about like you shouldn't be able to have a facade. And I was like, what's wrong with a
Hmm.
facade? Like in the more general definition of a facade, that there shouldn't be anything wrong
Yes.
with it. Um, and I think in like Laravel 5, it was harder to test things with using a facade, or like Laravel 6, but then that stopped being as much of an issue, but people are still, for some reason, mad about it. But a facade in Laravel gives you direct access to something bound as a singleton in the service provider, which I think that there are a lot of ways. This is my own thinking, not me being particularly advanced at Laravel because I'm definitely a junior. Don't take anything I say too seriously. Um, but I think there are a lot of ways to directly access a service if you really think about it and sit down and source dive. I think the facade being named in a certain way and importable in a certain way and recognizable to other Laravel developers is good because eventually people are going to want to reach for that information. But the fact that you can get like static access to that information, I guess, is supposed to be bad. I don't really know. But it's on
Yeah,
top of the.
I think the argument goes that the correct way, the correct air quotes here, way to do things is dependency injection, right? That you, if your if your class depends on another class, it should clearly indicate that to the world through like a constructor argument or a setter method. And that is like the right way to handle dependencies. That's how the argument goes. And so I think the argument against facades is that they, sort of obscure the dependency. They make it less obvious by referencing that dependency directly in your implementation rather than sort of doing uh, rather than getting at that dependency in a sort of traditional straightforward way, I suppose. And I think that there are times when, for me, that argument bears some weight, in that, like, depending on the type of code that you're writing and the way that code's going to be used, sometimes you do want to avoid accessing dependencies via facades because it makes sense to do it the other way. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a more concrete example, but I think a lot of times in package code, where where you're not the end consumer of your code, some other developer is, where that might be a case where you want the sort of like chain of dependencies to be um, more predictable, or you want to make it easier for those dependencies to be or mocked or faked or whatever. Because the other argument is, like, if your app is just like reaching out into the container and getting the container's version of a thing, then it makes it a lot harder to fake that thing, that dependency, just for your code. Although Laravel has ways to do that. Um, I don't know. I feel like I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but so I understand the argument against it, and sometimes I think there's value to thinking about, like, oh, is there a different way to get at this that maybe will make my code a little bit more testable, or easier to test in isolation. But most of the time, I don't think that actually plays out, and especially in like application code, I find that accessing things via facades oftentimes makes the code more testable, because it's like, the perfect example is HTTP requests, right? Like, if I have a service, right, that like receives a client interface, and the client receives a Guzzle interface, implementation of Guzzle, right, or PSR 7 or whatever it is, interface. And in my code, I have like a definition for that client and for that service, and it ultimately just gets like the default version of Guzzle, right? And the default version of that client and the default version of that service. Well, if I need to mock the HTTP requests for that service, now I have to instantiate a mocked Guzzle client and pass it into the client object, and then pass that client object into a, a service object, and then put that service object into the container or use that service object. I've had to like instantiate all these like intermediate dependencies just to fake one dependency down the chain. Whereas if my service code, like if I had a linear service that's talking to my ticket software, like, and that's just using the HTTP facade under the hood, I can just in my code write HTTP colon colon fake, and that's all I need to do to test, to like implement my tests. So I actually think that there are lots of places where the where using facades in your code actually makes your code more testable, not less testable. But that's just me going off on a little tangent here.
And I
But I
almost
guess
regret like bringing up that debate as like part of it, but all those things that you're talking about is the easiest way for me to say, like those are the parts of the facade in Laravel that are not generally parts of the pattern, if that makes sense.
right. So that's what I was going to ask. So the facade pattern itself is more a way to abstract a complicated system behind a simpler interface, correct?
Oh yeah, or obfuscate it completely. Like the
Uh huh.
complexity still exists, but when you have other objects interacting with just the facade and not the complexity behind the facade, you limit the amount of things that can go wrong and the complexity that you're interacting with. Like you just have the product of whatever the facade returns. The example from that book is the as like a compiler. Most of the compiler you don't want to touch directly unless you're just working with building the actual compiler. That's what I understand of it, anyways.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, and honestly, like in some ways, the eloquent query builder is a good example of a facade. It's like I am using just like the shared query building language, but under the hood, there's like the grammar. There's like the grammar objects that understand like the specific SQL dialect and compile SQL into something, and then there's like an executor that actually executes the code. Like there's a bunch of complicated pieces under the hood that take that query that I built and turn it into SQL statements that get sent to the database and turn those results back into objects for me. And I like don't have to, or I shouldn't really understand, have to like deal with any of those things under the hood. Does that feel right? I don't know.
I don't know if it's like a classical way of talking about it, but I think that functionally it's definitely the idea.
Yeah.
And then you have less things that can break and less things that are confusing for other people to read and less things that you have to consider. I even heard, like, even if you want to take it at a metaphorical level, because facade is the design pattern, I think, is actually kind of close to the word. I heard Taylor on an interview, I think it was with Prime recently, talking about like why he chose the license plate and like keeping in mind that, like, I don't know, Aaron Francis talks about this concept too, like the vanity of vanities thing. Like the things that we have are just eventually going to go away, like things are going to end and stuff like that. And if we're just like interacting with the way that things look or the way that we should be interacting with, we should remember that there's like additional complexity behind them. And I think that that fits perfectly in an eloquent query because there's, I mean, I think from my perspective, the model part of an MVC is like the biggest part of the triangle or whatever. You know,
Hmm.
there's a lot of things that make a application, in my opinion, perform better because of their absence. Um,
Okay.
if that makes sense. Like there's a lot of things you could do, but you probably shouldn't with databases.
Hmm. Yeah, that's fair.
I don't know if that was all over the place. It feels a little bit all over the place, but in general, yes.
No, yeah. I mean, I
There
think
we go.
you're right. I think that the query builder isn't a perfect example of a facade, but I think it struck me in that moment of like, oh, this is a place where that pattern is maybe sort of playing out, whether it's like intentional or not.
I
So
would I would
like,
definitely agree with that.
yeah, because like the facades in Laravel are almost like service. It's almost like service location, right? It's like they are just a mechanism to get access to instances that are bound in the container. So and honestly, like it doesn't actually have to be a singleton. I think almost always facades are, you almost always pair a facade with a singleton that's bound in the container. But like it doesn't have to, I don't think, right? It all the facade is doing is grabbing whatever it's whatever its underlying object that it's kind of wrapping is from the container and performing the operation on it. So like if that thing is not a singleton, I imagine that it would work just fine.
And like I think database would be an example of I'm guessing here, but I'm thinking database is an example of a facade that could have multiple instantiations of a class. If you have like multiple database connections in an
Mm,
application, but I think you can use the database facade for like
yeah,
whichever one you want
multiple
to grab.
connections. Hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
I like the idea of having a database facade, especially if I was making like a console command to just check real quick if something was going to work that I was going to put in a controller. I think that might be my favorite one.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I don't reach for that one that often, and I don't know why not. I think the auth facade I reach for all the time. The date facade I use a lot. Um, yeah, request
That's a great
I
one.
use a lot, and request is a good example of like that is like the request itself. The request object isn't bound to the container as a singleton. It's just when a new request comes in, the router uh, puts that instance in the container as like the current instance of the request. But if like if the same instance of the application handled three requests at three different times, the like current request would be different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I have to say that's still something that I have a hard time wrapping my head around.
Yeah, I mean, I've yet to use Octane. I've yet to do any I've yet to do anything where it's not just like a single request per instance of the application. And I do feel like I've always avoided it just because I know that there are many traps there that I would have to like, many mistakes that I would have to make, like you were saying at the beginning, to learn those lessons.
I I am very excited about that road,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, I have not really played around with it too much, but there's a couple reasons that I want to look deeply into it. I do have a hard time in general, though, conceptualizing the request as related to the service container because it's kind of a product and it's kind of a part of and it's kind of everything. It's like I don't know, like a wormhole or something. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that was one of those things that, because most things are bound to the container in like a specific, or like there's like a standard way, right? There's a idiomatic way that you do this, right? Typically things are bound to the container from like a service provider, right? The implementation is in the service provider, and it's either bound as a singleton or it's bound as, it's just like um, a factory essentially. And in the case of the request, what happens is as the request is getting handled by the router, it's actually the router that takes the instantiated request and like puts that instance in the container. And that's just like not common to how almost anything else is sort of added to the container in Laravel. And I definitely found that very confusing at first. I definitely agree. I mean, I still honestly, every once in a while, I open up the router and just like follow, like just walk through the all the functions that like a request is passed through and like the middleware chain and everything, just because I find that it's like hard for me to like keep that in my brain at all times. I have to come back to it from time to time.
I put a dump and die statement in a couple places during the middleware process and in the router
Mm-hmm.
once, and I felt like I went into like a different dimension. I had to like rest afterwards. It was a lot. It's
It
hard to keep
is
on the
it
back
is a
burner.
lot. Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I mean, that is one of my like there are a couple things that when I first came to Laravel, I felt like, "Oh, I wish that this was a little different. Maybe someday I'll like try to PR a change to this thing." And the one that I like idly think about from time to time, and I think that maybe it's just not technically possible, but I wish that there was a way to structure the request or just structure things so that all of the middleware wasn't in the stack because like anytime anything breaks in an application, right, you have all of the middleware frames in between, and it's just like it's just so much noise when you're debugging. And it's very hard to like follow just exactly how that piece works. I agree.
That's an interesting idea. The reaction that I had was kind of awe. Like I thought it was so beautiful, like the way the pipeline works, but I hadn't considered that. I think it would actually be a really interesting thing to try and log it out using
Mm,
the strategy pattern with like the undoable actions like made possible. Because if
mm.
you had a bunch of strategy patterns that you had like very clearly logging to a place and you could go through and be like, oh, okay, where did that break? I don't know. I'm sure that there's implementations of that somewhere in like the debugging printout that I just don't understand fully.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question though.
Sometimes I just want to build things myself so I understand like what they are, and then I find out that there's already a package that's that but a lot better.
Oh, 100%. I mean, yeah. I feel that. I mean, and sometimes I don't know, and sometimes it's good to build it anyway. Just so that you have it more in your bones. But yes, a lot of times someone else has already solved the problem, and it's like, I wanted to be the one to solve that problem.
My dad is like
Uh,
that with canned cheese, like the cheese whiz in a can. He's like, I could have done
okay.
that. I wish I was the one who did that.
I think about I have this argument with my business partner, or I used to. We don't. I think I finally got it into his head, but we always used to argue about art. He would always say like, I could have done that. I could have done that. And my response to him has always been, but you didn't. And I think that like when it comes to art, right? Sometimes you'll see something that's like technically not necessarily challenging, but the reality is that what makes it noteworthy or important is why it was done that way at the time that it was done and by whom and in what context, right? Like there's so many other more important questions there. And Yeah, it's kind of the same with product stuff. It's like it doesn't matter if you could do it. It just matters whether you did, right?
Yeah. And sometimes I get really pessimistic about things and I think, oh, everything is just marketing because you could have the most perfect implementation of something and everything works perfectly and it's just gorgeous code and it would solve so many problems for so many people. If people don't know about it, then like what does it matter? But
Yep.
I think that's why I got so excited about publishing your work increases your luck. Just the idea
Mhm.
of like, but you didn't though. Like, how's it going to feel at the end when you look back at all the things that like might have been similar to other people's work or might not have been good or anything like that, but like you could have done it. I don't know. I just like the idea of building silly things anyways. I mean, I made a portfolio website for myself on GitHub pages because I just wanted something like very static and easy to deploy. And I ended up
Mhm.
overthinking it for a really long time because I was like, okay, if I was going to make a spa from the beginning, like how would I do it? So the whole
Yeah.
thing is just like a single page application that is very clunky. But then sometimes when I look at React versus Vue, I'll be like, oh, that's how they answered that I really didn't even touch because, you know, it's just a portfolio site.
Yeah. No, I mean I think there's a lot to be said for I well, yeah, there's a lot to be said for the like if you don't put it out there, it doesn't really matter. Not and I don't mean that entirely. It's there are lots of times when you can do something that's just for yourself and then it doesn't matter if you put it out or not because like that's not the point, right? But if you're doing something for an external reason or a reason that like needs other people, whether it's for connection or whether it's for recognition or whether it's for profit or there's lots of different reasons that people put things out there. Like it just doesn't exist unless you do it, like it doesn't matter unless you do it. And I give this advice to our members all the time, so InterNACHI is a trade organization for home inspectors. And I say this to home inspectors all the time, but it really is true of almost every business. It's like being competent as a home inspector is the absolute ground floor of being a home inspector, and I think that's true of most businesses. It's like being competent at what you do, or being somewhat competent at what you do. Even is like that's the very beginning. It doesn't matter until you like are able to get yourself out there, until you're able to market yourself, until you're able to, connect with other people and show the world that you're competent. Because it's just being competent that can be super fulfilling in and of itself. But if you're trying to do it as a business, like that doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I try to recently, this is very off topic, but I try to ask myself what my motive is for doing things and try to be honest with
Hmm.
myself about like why I'm doing a thing. And I think a lot of the obsession with the design patterns in the first place was related to like my issues with putting myself out there
Okay.
and my own issues with questioning whether or not I'm competent, or like how would I know if I'm competent. And
Hmm.
I don't necessarily think that the talk went the way that I wanted to. And I think that there's still a lot farther that I'd like to go. But I like the idea of being able to engage in a community and like talk to people and say like, hey, it's okay if you don't feel competent or it's okay if you don't understand these terms. Like we could just talk about them. Like you could just
Hmm.
admit that you don't know things because
Yeah.
that's the first step to knowing them. And breaking things is the first step to building them or understanding why design patterns or packages are good in the first place. I think that's really cool about web design in general, or like not, well, web development when it comes to applications, is that even if you went to school, everybody has been so confused so many times. And everyone who's successful has just like pushed through over and over again. I think that there can be a lot of situations, even for people who are very experienced, that's like hard to name. I don't know. Names are good.
Yeah. Yeah. Names are good. That's for sure. Yeah. I mean, language is good, right? Having a way to communicate. Well, are there is there any other I'm trying to think and I'm drawing a blank, but were there any other patterns that you highlighted in your talk that you'd like to talk about now or any other concepts that kind of come to mind? I feel like we've covered a bunch of different topics.
Yeah, observers are weird.
Okay. Talk to
That's
me.
my observation on observers.
I see what you did there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that it's interesting to see it pointed out, like in those tweets that I included in my presentation, to see two people respond to a pattern in very different ways. Like even when we were talking about like having the sense of the builder pattern in
Mhm.
common, a lot of what I was trying to do was inspired by a video that Prime recorded that was like a reaction to another video of 8 design patterns that programmers should know, and it was
Okay.
written in Python. But he called the observer pattern like the pull your hair out slowly pattern because of all the unexpected consequences you might have from using an observer pattern. And I thought that it was really interesting that um, an event, which is not necessarily part of the pattern, but like the observer pattern basically works by having an observer that responds to changes in a model or changes in state in a model, and then it keeps everything like the system kind of self-referentially keeps the state up to date in multiple objects, and a lot of things can go wrong there. And then when you talk about a event sourcing pattern, a lot of times you're talking about like making a change in state, an object that you can talk about the actual change as if it's not like a verb as a change, but like a noun as a change. But obviously, there's problematic things with even the words that I chose. It's very difficult to talk about, but
I know that.
you could do this a lot better than I am, I'm sure.
No, these are hard things to talk about. When you get into like evented stuff and commands and observers, and it's just like there's a lot of jargon.
Yeah, but the idea, like, you don't even really have to look at a system with events in them as if they have events. You definitely don't have to turn those events into objects. And the difference between the action pattern being reusable and an action within an event, or like having the observer kind of injected into the event versus being a place to store events in
Okay.
versus being a way of looking at an entire system with state being managed between things, I thought was extremely interesting. I would love to hear any thoughts that you have on it or go deeper into it when I find good words to describe those things.
Yeah, I mean, my main take on like evented applications, and I say that as something slightly different than event sourcing, but my take on like systems that are reactionary, right? That where a lot of the effects that happen in the application are in reaction to something happening, right? And like an observer would be one way to do that. I think that the problem is in the world that I'm in the Laravel world, we don't do that most of the time. And in other sort of like programming ecosystems that I've been involved in, like even in JavaScript where, in the browser you're dealing with events and the event loop and reactions to events all the time. Uh it's well, I don't know, but I find that the biggest problem with that approach is not not being the primary interface to your code, right? So, like in our application, for example, we have a handful of observers that react to events that eloquent models fire, right? So, like when a user gets updated, there's an observer that triggers a bunch of webhooks that go out to like third-party services that care about user state changes. And because that's like one of the very few places where this happens in our application, you just don't think to check that when something goes wrong. I think that that's the biggest problem is like you've now sort of abstracted you've just like spread the functionality out in a way that like can be very useful, but if you're not doing it all the time in your application, like becomes hard to keep track of. I don't know if that makes sense or if that answers or speaks to what you were saying at all, but that's kind of my observation about the observer pattern.
I think that it does make a lot of sense, and it's also kind of confusing that it's a pattern in the sense that patterns are supposed to solve problems, but lots of times with that one in particular or with other patterns, trying to implement them can also cause patterns. It's just weird. Just an
Mhm.
observation I have. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you go back to the what we were kind of saying at the very beginning, this is a way that people solve problems. And so having a name for it and having a shared understanding of when I say observer, this is generally what I mean. Even if it's not necessarily a great solution all the time, maybe it's only a good solution some of the time. It's still useful to have a name for it so we can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I read somewhere that somebody was trying to make an argument that the entire Laravel request cycle could be seen as a not canonical implementation of an observer system because all the changes that are happening to the request are affected by all the previous changes and stuff, and the state kind of like relies on previous state. But
Interesting.
that's I'm gonna figure that out in like 5 years, and I'll write a blog post about it or something. I don't know, way over my
Yeah,
head.
that is I'm trying to to sort of like figure out how to make that work in my head, but it's certainly not going to happen without like looking at something, I don't think.
Yeah,
Well, this has been really fun. I'm really looking forward to your talk in I guess it's what, 2 weeks?
maybe a
And
week.
oh
October's
yeah,
flying
maybe a
by.
week. It really is. Yeah, like a week and a half it looks like. But and
Okay,
yeah,
then I have more
I
time.
don't know. I
That's good.
appreciate I really appreciate like getting a chance to I don't know, think about these concepts in a different way because I do really think I noticed that I've gotten almost like sort of defensive whenever anyone brings out like, inversion of control or like dependency injection or chain of responsibility or whatever. Like these those terms often come out when someone is saying, "Oh, the way you do it in Laravel is wrong." And so I find myself just like immediately kind of like being prepared to have to defend or fight about something. But in a lot of ways, having language to talk about these things is just really useful. And I'm appreciating that more. So thank you.
Well, I had a really great time talking to you, and I mean, I hope that it's a an okay argument, that it's not just me being silly. It rings true to me, honestly. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you can. I don't know if one can say that code is wrong if it works, and Laravel does tend to work pretty well for a lot of people. So,
Yes.
and this is really one of my favorite podcasts, and I am honored to be here, and it's always really wonderful to talk to you. So,
I
thank you for having
appreciate
me
that
on.
so much. Well, before we go, um, how do people find you on the internet?
I'm pretty much only on the website formerly known as Twitter at Cifrius and Pinkary with the same name, Sifrious.
Okay.
So
And is there anything that you would like to plug? Anything that you want to give a shout out to or uh, ask people to check out?
can't really think off the top of my head. Pan looks cool. I'm gonna look at that later. I don't
It
know.
does look cool. Yeah, I've been hoping that someone would tackle this problem for a long time, so I'm excited to see. I haven't had a chance to look at it at all other than just the the little video clips that have been coming across my Twitter feed. But very cool. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to shout out again your talk. Hopefully, your I think your New York talk's going to be up on the internet in a couple weeks. So
Oh, that's
look
true.
out
I
for
should have thought
that.
of that first, huh?
And I'm going to try to figure out how to record your talk in Philly. So maybe your Philly talk will get onto the internet as well. We'll see. No promises, but I'll see what I can do.
Cool.
All right. Well, then until next time. This has been great.
Until next time.